Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Hotline. If you are obsessive compulsive, press 1 repeatedly. If you are codependent, ask someone to press 2 for you. If you have multiple personalities, press 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you are paranoid, we know what you are and what you want. Stay on the line and we'll trace your call. If you're delusional, press 7 and your call will be transferred to the mothership. If you are schizophrenic, listen carefully and a small voice will tell you which number to press. If you are depressive, it doesn't matter which number you press, no one will answer you. If you're dyslexic, press 69696969. If you have a nervous disorder, please fidget with the hash key until the beep. After the beep, please wait for the beep. If you have a short-term memory loss, please try your call again later. And if you have low self-esteem, hang up. All our operators are too busy to talk to you.
Good evening, folks. Welcome to another episode of Lorries Talk News Radio. It's Saturday, February the 2nd, 2013. This evening we've got a very special guest indeed, Scott Bartle from Australia. I ran across his YouTube video a while back. I've been trying to get a hold of him since. I finally got a hold of him. This man had apparently bought a Corvette, had it restored, and was in the process of importing it into Australia when he started running into a whole hornet's nest of activity and just some things that apparently did not seem quite right to him. So he started checking into what was going on, who was involved, and his story is most interesting and ties quite a bit into things that we've covered in this show about two parallel governments. So that being said, I'd like to welcome Scott to the show and thank him for joining us. How are you doing this evening, Scott?
Laurie, good evening, and I absolutely love that introduction with the phone message there. It's a beauty.
Well, thank you. I heard that on somebody else's show, and I thought, I've got to get that because it kind of sums up the world we live in anymore.
It's brilliant, yeah.
So tell us how you got in this. I mean, I guess just from the beginning, you obviously either just wanted a Corvette or you've always liked them, I don't know, and then you, instead of buying a new one, you want one of the older ones. And folks, there's pictures of it on there. I put a link in the chat room for those who'd like to watch this video. Have you always liked Corvettes, or you just found this one and liked it and decided to restore it, or how did that all come about?
Yeah, I've always had an interest in Corvettes. A number of my mates have had them. Belonged to Corvette clubs in Australia for many years. And I started researching them and going along to some of the shows and checking out which ones I liked, and just absolutely loved the 1959. The balance of chrome work on it, the body styling, the shape, the symmetry on the dash, just absolutely loved it. So, I fell in love with that one and decided to get that one and found it right-hand drive. And, started the process to import it to Australia.
And so you did all this, I would assume, over the phone or letters, whatever, because if I recall correctly, you bought it and had it restored here in the States, right? And then you were importing it already restored?
Yeah, it was imported already restored. So basically my trouble started with the Department of Transport here in Australia. I was following all the conventional process and believed at the time that I needed a import approval to even begin to ship it to Australia. And going through that process, one of the schemes that they had to import the car was this scheme called a pre-1989 scheme. Basically what that meant was they said if your car is older than or manufactured prior to 1989, then we consider it a vintage, a classic. It doesn't necessarily have to meet the safety standards of today's modern-day cars with the Australian design rules and do all sorts of stupid stuff to it, like reinforcing bumpers and fitting weird seat belts that the cars of the classic vintage just don't have. So in doing that, I was applying for this import approval under this pre-1989 scheme, and the department had published these guidelines to assist in this application for the import. And what I found was that I was refused or denied import approval, and they quoted from these guidelines. And I went, hang on a minute, no, that doesn't really make sense. Went and produced a flow diagram and showed them graphically what their guidelines were saying, and said, look, you're not even following your own guidelines here. Asked them for a review. They then rejected the request for a review and quoted more of the same guidelines. And I'm just scratching my head thinking, hang on, these guys are not even getting this message here. They're not even seeing it graphically when you lay it all out. A follows B, etc. And ended up taking it to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which again was a legal and conventional kind of process, and presented flow diagrams and PowerPoint presentations demonstrating how they were not interpreting their own guidelines. And what came out in this tribunal was that the guidelines had been pulled from my access. They were said, well, you can't rely on them, they're not law. And that had me absolutely baffled.
Now, wait a minute. They told you that you couldn't rely on it because it was not law?
Yes, and ironically quoted from it twice in refusing my application. So I'm like, how does that work? It's we can use it to deny your import approval, but you can't use it to quote it back at us.
Ah.
So I'm like, hang on. Now, we've got double standards going on here. So this 9-month process, and ultimately I was awarded import approval based on there was two senior members who sat on this tribunal hearing, and they gave it a good look and ultimately awarded in my favour, not due to any of my arguments, purely on a photograph of the car. I went, yeah, well, that's a 1959 car. It's pre-1989. Yep, yeah, import approval. What are you complaining about? So conveniently, that allowed the process for the Department of Transport to continue on doing whatever they liked and refusing people based on the guidelines. And I was very suspicious of all of this, thinking, hang on a minute, the situation that existed or that arose and allowed this to happen hasn't been addressed. Okay, I've got my import approval, and yet what I've discovered is a whole heap of dodgy stuff going on. It's not quite right. That's not what I would call public service working for the people. And so that was what really sparked my desire to find out what was happening. And then along came customs, and that starts a whole new sort of story.
So the initial approval first said, well, wait up a minute. And then they said, well, okay, it is free. It's early enough that it doesn't have to have this, so we'll just do it because we're nice guys, not because you quoted back their own regulations, which they'd already told you was not even law. So this kind of got you thinking about that. And then from there, this is where it ended up becoming an issue with the air conditioners, I recall.
Yeah. So I've got the import approval, got the car on the boat. Now, before I got the car shipped out to Australia, I requested from the customs broker a breakdown of every single charge that I'd be up for when the car arrived. So I knew I was going to be paying shipping fees. I knew I was going to pay shipping insurance, dock fees, customs clearance, goods and services tax or GST, luxury car tax because it went over a certain bracket. So I knew I was going to be paying all of these things. Now, when the car arrived in Fremantle, out of the blue came another demand for you have to apply for a license to a pre-charged equipment license, basically this license to import the air conditioner or the gas and that was the point where I went, hang on a minute, nah, what you've effectively done is you've got me over the barrel. My car is sitting in customs locked up in quarantine and in that on that side of the fence, if you like. And now you're saying I can't get to it unless I pay this other fee, which I had absolutely no idea about, having previously requested evidence and itemisation of all of the fees. So I thought I'd done my due diligence and research to find out everything that I'd be up for, and I got surprised when it came out and said, oh, you have to pay this other fee. Now, subsequently, I found out that there's other car owners around Perth and Australia who are actually found out about that same tax at exactly the same point, i.e., or that is once their car was in the country, but still in the control of the so-called government. So I was like, hang on, no, this is shaping up more like extortion here. So I started asking some questions of who these guys were. And during my 9 months of process with the Department of Transport, I started learning that things were not as they appeared to be. And within the documentary, you'll see I started spotting things like copyright symbols against the Commonwealth of Australia. And I'm going, well, hang on a minute. You don't copyright something that unless it's like a legal entity, or that doesn't really make sense. And who owns this copyright? I haven't seen a certificate that says I own it, or a part owner of it. I started seeing these other things that raised my eyebrows. I started seeing a company registered in Washington, D.C. On the Securities Exchange Commission called the Commonwealth of Australia. And that sort of raised my eyebrows and said, why is there a company registered over there with the same name as the Commonwealth of Australia here in Australia? Why is this copyright symbol on there? What's going on? Are we operating like a corporate environment that's layered itself over the top of the real Commonwealth? And so when I started questioning the likes of the Department of the Environment, the Minister, first thing that came back was, you're exempt from this licence to import the pre-charged equipment licence on the air conditioner. And I thought, wow, all I've done is ask who he works for, whether he works for some company over in Washington or whether he's real Commonwealth, essentially. And so upon getting that sort of release, I'm like, oh, hang on, maybe there's more to it than this. And so I kept digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And, so that was basically the origins of how I started to challenge customs and this twin or parallel government scenario.
Well, this is very interesting that you'd bring up about these little symbols and logos that were all copywritten, because one of the things that I've tried pointing out to people here in the States is this statutory law. Now, they have them all over, there's federal, state, so on and so forth, and I happen to have a copy. I'm here on Alaska. You'll notice I said on Alaska. I'm not in Alaska yet. But anyway, I happen to have a copy of the statutory quote-unquote laws, and sure enough, I heard somebody say it, they're copywritten. Well, if these are public laws for we the people, they ought not be being private laws. They ought to be public laws, which means they wouldn't be copywritten, but lo and behold, they are to LexisNexis. And it sounds like you've run into the same thing here where these different, and I'm quoting here, government institutions or departments or whatever are sending you official-sounding, official-looking documents when they're a private corporation apparently tied to Washington, D.C. And so this is what you found?
Yep, exactly. Now, just to support that, and this is something I only just came across very recently, was a definition within a UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, essentially rule book, and it defined what was it? I'll see if I can find it.
The the United States is a corporation?
Well, it actually didn't say that. It specifically said the United States, or the location of the United States is within the District of Columbia. Oh, hang on a minute.
Right, that should be UCC 3002, if memory serves.
So, you wonder, hang on a minute, how does the United States get within the District of Columbia? Shouldn't it be the other way around?
Yes.
And that's when we're thinking land masses and the actual geography of it. When you start thinking of these things as a piece of paper, it's a lot easier to go, oh, well, the United States, the registered piece of paper, yeah, certainly that can be within the District of Columbia.
Wow. So these, and this is what I think caught me the most. I'm fairly well familiar with what you're talking about here in the States, but I guess, and again with the Vatican and the Crown in England, the 1 square mile within the city of London, so on and so forth. But I guess I didn't really realize until I started hearing you and some others that this whole U.S. corporation extends outside even of our borders, and that's what it sounds like to me, and you seem to have rather stumbled across this in a manner of speaking.
Well, even if that extension is by way of a sub-corporation registered within the United States, which is what I believe most that I'm working with are under the impression of it being. And perhaps you might find that there's people who say, oh, hang on, this is all a load of rubbish and all the rest of it. And what we started doing was drawing attention on definitions that were clearly laid out in the Constitution, the original Constitution for the Commonwealth of Australia here in 1900, which is actually an Act of Parliament out of the United Kingdom. Anyway, there's definitions there. For example, the Parliament is clearly spelled out as the Parliament shall be the Parliament of the Commonwealth. And then you go online and go have a look in Canberra, the capital city, and we've got something called the Parliament of Australia. So you've got these two different names. One in the Constitution says the Parliament of the Commonwealth, and then this other one called the Parliament of Australia. Now, so far, not one politician, not one minister, judge, you name it, across Australia that we've asked, and there must be up around the 50 of them now, have been even attempted to explain why the name of the Parliament in force at the moment, or today's Parliament, is not what it's called in the Constitution. And that presents a couple of scenarios. We've either got a Constitution that doesn't mean squat, and you can make definitions up and do whatever you like with them, scribble in the margin if you want, or alternatively, it tells me that there's two entities. And the instant that you get two entities, you get one of them that's legitimate, and I'd go with the one that's laid out in the Constitution, and the other one's an imposter. And the same thing happens with the name of government. Constitution spells out Government of the Commonwealth, and currently you get mail in the letterbox that is headed up Australian government. So the question in my mind is, hang on, are there two? And not one of the politicians that we've asked has been able to address that. Rather interestingly, and a friend of mine wrote to the Attorney General and asked exactly that same question, and just recently she resigned. Now, whether a coincidence, we're yet to find out. Who knows?
Well, this is just so interesting to me, and I'm sure to others that have studied this, because we have, again, the parallels are uncanny. We too, and most people are in this country and we are not aware of this, We're certainly not taught it in school. I was not aware for a long time. We actually have multiple constitutions in this country as well. And the one we use today is, as you said, it's a corporate constitution. The organic constitution that people will have to go back and research or go back to some of the show archives to discuss that very subject is the original one that is of the, what you would call the Commonwealth or the common law one, and the one we have today is the corporate one. And it just absolutely amazes me when you start, I don't know if you've looked that intimately into your own country's history as far as when that changed and that type of thing. I mean, ours really seemed to happen around the Civil War. Again, you have to go to the archives, folks, for all the intimate details. But there have been several changes there, and it sounds like they've done the same thing. I don't even know what to call it that they have to you. There was originally a government upborn by the people, if you will. Ours spells it out specifically that way, and somehow over time there's this other corporate entity that snuck in and taken over, acting as the government, and that's what it sounds like you've run into here as well.
Yeah, and what's seeming the methodology that we've been using to some reasonable success here in Australia is just pointing out the look, I'm happy to pay these taxes that you're claiming from me. I'm happy to do this or do that. There in my mind is some reasonable doubt that you actually are operating from the lawful office. Could you please provide the evidence that you are a legitimate public servant, or in our case, a Commonwealth officer? And with a little bit of research, and most of this is not new. I haven't necessarily gone and reinvented the wheel and had to dig all this up from scratch. There's a lot of people out there who will have already done this research for you. And the spin that I put on it, I suppose, was if you're not real government, you're not real government. And from that point, why should we ever treat those folk as real government? If they're purely working as a corporate entity or for a corporate entity for the benefit of shareholders, not for the benefit of the people, I mean, to me, the arrow of the line of reporting, if you put this down on an organisation chart, government reports to the people, works for the people. Corporations work for the shareholders and reports to the shareholders. So you've got a completely opposite spectrum of the direction of the reporting and the money flow. And so once we would determine that we're just dealing with corporate, treat them as corporate and start offering terms and conditions and holding them to it. The tricky thing is, how does one enforce the payment of the invoices when your friendly police force have been usurped as well?
Right. So let me guess, Scott. So when you ask either these corporations pawning themselves off as government or some of these officers, quote unquote, and officials, quote unquote, one of two things: they either don't have a clue in the world of what you're speaking of, or they're absolutely silent on the issue. Is that the general response or lack thereof?
100%. And the tricky thing is, unfortunately, what it appears is the folk that you're dealing with on the front line, and this even goes up to a very high level, ministers, all sorts, they are largely unaware of what is going on. Now, what that does is it presents a certain, to me, an obligation on my part to be able to communicate to them and have them reach the same understanding that I have, that something's not right and that they are actually working for this corporate entity. And what I found was that by telling them they're working for a corporation was just not going very well at all. You walk into any government department and say, you guys just work for a corporation. First response is, you're a nutcase. No, we don't. Of course, we're public servants. Look at my badge. Look at the sign above my desk. Look at my stamp. Look at my letterhead. Of course I'm government. And these are the people who rely upon a pay pack each week to pay their mortgage, and that's a whole different story, another kettle of fraud.
Yes, it is.
And so how do you communicate to them? How do they reach that point where they go, oh, actually, this is not quite right. Now, in Australia, we've managed to boil it down to one simple question. And we're lucky enough to be able to go back to, I suppose by exercise, say, for example, there's a charge or a claim that's been made over you by a certain department or something, say the Department of Transport or this Minister for the Environment, just to use the Corvette example. That minister and that Department of Environment are reliant upon ultimately one single fact. The act that established the Department of the Environment and that act is given royal assent by a governor. The appointment as a minister is also done by a governor. And in the case of a federal department, the Governor-General. So then we ask, well, what's the authority of the Governor-General? In Australia, that office is reliant upon, that authority is reliant upon the office of the Governor-General. Now, the original office of Governor-General in Australia was constituted by the late Queen Victoria in 1900. And she specifically reserved full power and authority to heirs and successors of herself to revoke, alter or amend those letters patent that constituted that office of Governor-General. And so what we've got is one simple question where we ask, were those letters patent revoked in accordance with Queen Victoria's strict reservation of power and authority, and were they revoked by an heir and successor? And so it's a very straightforward question, and we actually put a petition up to the Queen, and we're actually going to be submitting that one fairly soon, that spells out that question in its entirety. And what we've got in Australia is, in around 1984, there's another set of letters patent that constituted an office of Governor-General, and that's the one that they're working from, or the current office can be traced back to. So the issue in Australia is, was the original office revoked? If it wasn't, then it remains in perpetuity as valid and lawful to this day. It would make the current office that traces back to a 1984 document a parallel system, and everything that came out of that is completely unlawful and falls on its face very quickly. So it's a reasonably straightforward process here in Australia, knowing now what we know. And again, this same question asked to judges, ministers, even the governors and the Governor-General herself, as they've all gone avoided. I can even quote from an answer of what the governor actually responded with. And they wrote and said, your notice has no legal or constitutional efficacy, and I do not intend to respond to it or any other correspondence from you on the matter. So they're very unwilling and reluctant to answer questions about the lawful validity of their office.
Well, Scott, lest I forget, any of that documentation that you have that I could get, even if you had to black some things out, I'd love to have that, because those are the types of documents I think that we need to see so that we understand what's going on. Now, you brought up a very interesting point here about the front-line people. The majority of them don't have a clue in the world. And we have the same thing here. I know that a lot of these cops, that's what we call them here, and what you all call them there, coppers or whatever, a lot of them just genuinely are not aware. In fact, it's been estimated, I don't know what reliability you put on these numbers, but that as few as about 5% of some of these positions lawyers, judges, police chiefs, so on and so forth, are aware of any of this. But of the ones that do, I can well imagine that they would want to not say much of anything or deny they even knew, because to me, if this is not rank treason, impersonating a government official is a serious thing, if it's treasonous or not. I would press treasonous because of the way it's being used and enacted. So you're running into pretty much the same thing there, it sounds like.
Oh, 100%, yeah. And you're right. It's the unfortunate thing that most of the folk that you would ordinarily turn to for your protection, that is the police, are being screwed over as well. They're in the system. They're having to pay these taxes to the same organisation. And I think ultimately the common denominator that seems to be across the board is a lot of us are involved in some way or another with a bank, whether it be a credit card or a mortgage. And the poor guys who are struggling to make ends meet to pay these mortgages, if they only knew that those were complete frauds and that they didn't actually need to pay these mortgages, they might find themselves in a slightly different position. However, it's a certain or a large level of knowledge to be able to pull that together and deal with it and sort out the banks and their henchmen that they engage to sort them out.
Okay, now, you mentioned something else, too, I'd like to pick up on. Of course, I'm more familiar with terms and phrases here for the States, so we'll have to, whatever you guys call them there. You had mentioned earlier about how some of these departments of or whatever, they are created by law. In this case, a lot of times they will pass an act that says an act to create the department of, fill in the blank, and then they will usually give them statutory authority, and I use that term loosely and advisedly, to create policies and regulations as they see fit to manage whatever the department of is. And then those policies and regulations are not law, they're not positive law, they're color of law, yet they are treated as though they are law, and then all of a sudden we, the people, that should not fall under these at all, we're suddenly being told we are bound by these and must obey and follow and pay or whatever it is required. Is that what you have there as well?
Yep, same thing. And what we found was rather than go and argue about the validity of their policies or their statutes or their little laws and regulations, was if the department itself that originated or an attempt to enforce those laws and rules and policies and all the rest of it, if that department itself is itself unlawful or unconstitutional, then everything that's subsidiary to that department falls in a heap.
Okay. Now I want to see if I can connect some dots here for some folks, because this hit me, I don't know, a year or so ago. It just hit me like a ton of bricks with this whole scenario, what we're speaking of. So we have a government, the real one, we'll call it, for lack of a better word here, but they make these acts, they create these departments. They usually have a commissioner. Frequently they're a commissioner, which is interesting because the commissioners are appointed and serve at the leisure of, fill in the blank, the President of the United States, the Governor of the state, so on and so forth. So they're appointed. They are not bound by we the people. Then they have these statutes and regulations, policies, so on and so forth, that are treated as law that are not. And so if you question it, the politicians of the quote-unquote real government say, well, wait a minute, that's not us. That's their policies. That's their regulations. Well, it sounds like a real neat way to me to sidestep the issue of prohibitions of government by creating these departments, appointing commissioners with regulations and policies, and then be able to hide and say, well, we're not doing it. It's not us. It's them. It's their regulations, policy. So really the government is doing things that are unconstitutional, but they're playing a little shell game with us. Does that make sense? Did I explain that? properly?
I think I've got the picture, and it seems as well that you may well have. I mean, you mentioned governors there, who either commission various commissioners or whoever. If the authority of those who did that appointing turned out to be unlawful or unconstitutional, then to me everything that that individual has done, who has been unlawfully or unconstitutionally appointed, is null and void. Would that sound to be the case?
Well, that's why I said the so-called government, because this rabbit hole goes mighty deep. But yes, you are exactly correct. And a perfect case in point is this with vaccinations. Okay, we have this Department of Health. It puts out these what do they put them as recommended, and sometimes they use words like mandatory and this and that are not laws. They're policies and regulations. The parents, by the time it trickles down through the school, they go, well, your child has to have this and this and this and this, or they can't go to school. Well, wait a minute. What about the exception, the exemption form you have sitting in your drawer there? And they're not going to tell you about it. And so the whole thing is they, the government, quote unquote, are making these vaccinations mandatory or highly recommended, but they're doing it in an indirect way by making Department of and appointing commissioners. That was the point I was trying to get at. Right.
One thing I will question is you mentioned about them not highlighting exemptions. The temptation there is for people to grab at that and go, oh, hang on, you didn't tell me about the exemption. What tends to happen there is you've glossed over the fact that that department may or may not be created lawfully, and you've also bypassed the issue of whether that regulation was lawful. And so the same thing we're doing here in Australia is the instant you start talking detail of, say, for example, back to the Corvette, the amount of the tax that I might be demanded from me, or what that tax is actually for, I'm automatically skipping the issue of the lawful validity of who's demanding it from me and the instrument that they're using to demand it from me with. And we've pushed all of that aside and gone back to look at those exact issues of what is the lawful validity of those giving the authority. And we've basically, you'll see on my website, truth-now.net, a series of diagrams, and here we all trace it back to the Governor or the Governor-General for the Commonwealth. It's a straightforward diagram that goes right back to the office of the governors and looks at their authority. Without that, anything that comes out underneath is a nonsense and is unlawful and void. So you may have the same thing happening in the States, that if you can go to that and look for and demand that evidence of the validity of that office. And here's the thing, we were finding people in Australia going, oh, but they haven't answered my questions, they have to. Well, no, they don't have to, particularly if they turn out to be working for a corporation. If you're not an employee, if you're not a shareholder of that corporation, they most certainly do not have to answer you. We just think that they're government still, think that they're working for us, and therefore we jump up and down when they don't answer. Instead, what we did was we said, well, if you don't want to answer, that's great. The conventional process for non-answering of requests for information in that regard is a default. Courts use a default judgment. An ATM machine will use a default judgment against you in a way. You put your card in the machine and don't push any buttons, in 20 seconds it'll spit your card back out. The default judgment was you didn't want a transaction.
Well, that is exactly correct, and this default and acquiescence, you're absolutely right, plays a pretty big role in law and in courts and that type of thing. And I think you're also right, too, with getting caught up in the minutia. It is very easy and tempting to get caught up in the minutia, but the problem that I found is if you turn around and make a blatant statement that the entirety of what we call the United States government based in Washington, D.C., is a corporation and therefore a hoax and has no lawful validity to it, I don't know as I've ever had that many heads on top of my shoulder when I tell people things like that. So you tend to start trying to say, okay, well, the Federal Reserve, they're private. They're just now getting it. Now, look, there's people who have been talking about this for decades. And people are now, thanks to Ron Paul, starting to get it. And now they're starting to get some of these other parts, too. So I see your point of not getting bogged down in the minutia, but on the other hand, if you just come out on the blatant other end of the spectrum and make a statement like that, so I think that's where we're trying to get people to understand this whole thing is a big shell game, really.
Yeah. Well, the thing I'd say in response to that is you need not make the declaration that the government in Washington is unlawful. Is what you can say is in absolute certainty. If you've asked the questions of some people who would reasonably be expected to produce the evidence they are legitimate, that haven't provided you with that evidence, you can quite comfortably and with confidence say, I have not received evidence upon multiple requests for this evidence that today's government is lawfully constituted. So you can quite easily make that statement, and it comes at the end of a process of having documented and asked for that evidence all the way through. So you're not saying, well, you guys are a bunch of criminals. You might be able to say that quite easily after you've got to that final point. However, you're likely to run into the resistance from most of the people who are still struggling with that concept. However, if you say, I haven't received any evidence that demonstrates these guys are presently lawfully constituted, you can say that statement quite comfortably.
Right. Well, and I don't know if this is the phrase or an expression there down under, as everybody seems to call it, but it is here for the most part, but some people have heard of it. This kind of opens up a whole other bailiwick, and that is that when you start to realize these things, one almost begins to question all of these different departments of and things. I mean, the Department of Fish and Game, are they part of this corporation? Do we have to play this little cat and mouse game with each and every individual one of these to have them prove to us that they are a lawful, bona fide portion of the de jure government? Have you run into that as well, or do some of these places, once you crack the nutshell, as it were, do they start to acquiesce and just leave you alone? Rhetorical question, I fear.
Yeah, a lot of them are acquiescing and leaving us alone. And what's been interesting is we've been approaching a lot of the, let's call it the small fish in the game, and they've got absolutely no clue. Now, I suspect that they're raising the matter through to their superiors, and hopefully it gets back to the governor. And maybe that's why today's governor has been writing back with comments that says, I ask that you advise his supporters not to send any such notice in the future. And maybe the message is getting through to him. And so I would tend to approach it for future matters that I deal with is I would send my request to the highest authority you can think of and send a copy of that documentation to the, let's say, the small fish again that you're dealing with on that front line. So what that does is it says, I'm taking steps to determine the lawful validity of your office by determining the lawful validity of 3 or 4 steps up the chain. And it's, in that sense, it's a bit of an education process for the small fish. And if you follow that process all the way through and send your next notice and says, well, sorry, Mr. Governor or whoever, as of this date, having given you reasonable period of time, 21 days, 14 days, whatever, I haven't received the evidence that your office is lawfully constituted. Have another 7 days, or however the process goes through to give them that reasonable period of time to provide the evidence. the small fish are following this process along and going, that's interesting. The lawful validity of his office is what supports the lawful validity of my office, and the guy at the top of the tree can't or is unwilling to provide that information. What's happening? And so that's where I think this process is, in some way, an education for those folk at the ground level, and hopefully, as we grow this and more people catch on that, hang on, there is no evidence being provided or forthcoming that these guys are lawfully constituted. What's happening? And maybe conversation around the coffee machine will grow to a slightly more intellectual level rather than the Spice Girls are reunited or something.
Yeah. Well, Scott, you hit on what I believe is a very, very key subject here, and that is that of education. And I think you're right. We, too, in this country have been having some successes. There have been police officers that have been backed down. There have been judges that have been backed down. There are judges that have been had the bailiffs told to arrest that man or woman sitting on the bench, that is. And this leads me to another thing, too, that while we have some successes, some of these succeed, some of them fail, and I think a lot of people that have at least heard of some of these issues are kind of sitting back in the background waiting on this magic bullet, this end-all, be-all, fix-all, and frankly, I got to tell folks, I don't think there is one. You have to understand the game that's being played and learn the rules of how to play it. And I think that's why this education is so absolutely critical that you brought up. And that's what shows like this are about, trying to bring these points to light.
Yeah. Well, I think also to talk to that is there's a certain energy of intent that comes along with these processes. If you approach this, say, for example, you get a simple parking ticket, and you approach it with, oh my God, they're going to take my license away from me, they're going to do this, they're going to arrest me, they're going to do all of that. Well, chances are they probably will. If you come at it and go, well, hang on, who are these guys? I haven't seen any authority from these guys to say they've got the lawful validity to do this. I'm going to sit here and ask, and I'm happy to pay until and when I see that information, I'll pay. Now, the two different energies that surround those, the mindset of those two people pursuing that process, you can put exactly the same documentation in place, and I suspect the result will be completely different in doing that same process.
Well, that's interesting. That brings up another little subject, too, because there's a third one that I've noticed in this country. I don't know if y'all have it there or not. I'll try to keep a civil tongue here, but there's other ones going, this is BS. We'll see about this. I'm going to hand them their own butts on a silver platter. Well, look, folks, you can take that posture if you like. I wouldn't recommend it because there are a lot of cops out there who got pretty itchy trigger fingers, including on their tasers and their billy clubs. That's probably not the best attitude to take. Do you guys have that same attitude or mentality in part there?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. The one of the things, I actually saw a YouTube video of a gentleman in court, let's just say slinging mud at the judge, and he was in there giving him all sorts of, telling him off. Now, granted, the information may have been factual, however, I would question the effectiveness of his communication. Did he actually get the message through, or did the judge sit there and shut down, as in you see his eyes roll back in his head, or the shutters come down and he glazes over, and is thinking, well, I can't wait to get this guy out of the court, I'm going to send him to jail or fine him or whatever. The intent behind it is ultimately the police out there, I would say most of them, didn't join to go point a radar gun at you, didn't join to go and fine you for crossing the road at a stupid angle or any of these silly little infringements that have been invented out of thin air. Most of them, I'm pretty sure, are just like you and I. They've got a family and they've got a life. They're just people, all of us. And so going out there and sorting them out with that, I'm going to show this guy what's what and all the rest of it, I believe is detrimental to the end game of where you want to get to. If you've got the support of a police officer who's going, actually, yeah, I can see, yeah. I mean, I can share a story of a guy who went through the process of determining the lawful validity of the police here in Australia, or Western Australia. Ultimately found out that they worked for a corporation, provided terms and conditions to them, and when his daughter was pulled over by the police for driving with a mobile phone, whilst talking on a mobile phone and driving an unregistered car, the police started giving her a hard time. And she went, well, hang on, that's not my car. This is my father's car. When the police found out whose car it was, their attitude changed 180 degrees. Suddenly they had things to do and places to be, and said, oh, we'll take that up with him, and you have a nice day, man. Now, he'd never heard anything from them since. So it would appear that they've made the conscious choice to, okay, I'll turn my eyes away from this one and I'll go continue doing my ordinary job with a path of least resistance. Now, you could comment a whole range of things on that. But from what I take from that is those police are aware of what they're doing now. They're aware of the position they're in. And it wouldn't surprise me if they go home to their families and go, you know what? This idea of being a police officer is not what I quite thought it was going to be.
Well, Scott, that brings up right exactly where I wanted to go, but I want to hold that thought for a minute. We've got a caller in the queue. I'd like to open up and see if they have a question or a comment for you.
Sure.
613, you're on the air. Who do we have here?
Yes, hi, Daryl phoning. How are you tonight?
Pretty good, Gerald. Do you have a question or a comment for Scott?
Well, actually, yes. I've been listening to your comments and so forth. And are you guys aware that under the UCC, the United States has been foreclosed on?
I've heard such rumblings, yes.
The docket
Daryl,
number...
Yes.
Go ahead, Scott.
Sorry, Daryl, yes. I'm following that matter or that issue very closely. I'm very excited about it, as I believe it applies to all international equivalents. And yes, I'm following that quite closely, and I think it's got a lot of potential. There's a bit of groundwork to do to get my head around it. Absolutely loving the ramifications that come from that.
Most certainly is. So you guys are aware of that, so I'll leave it with you. And let's see what happens here in the next few days.
Okay, well, I appreciate your comment there, because this is the exact type of news here that actually does, help people that they have a document, some kind of official record they can go to and look at. Now, Daryl, on the outside chance you may want back in the queue, your hand's still raised, so if you press 1 and wait a minute, then you can press 1 later if you want back in the queue, but otherwise I'll just assume that you're listening. Okay, so Scott, back to this issue, what you were talking about a moment ago with police officers and this type of thing, and the example you gave us with, path of least resistance. It's interesting because the reason I had asked you earlier about are you finding if these people are leaving you alone, not you personally, but the people that are pressing this, I've likened a lot of this almost to a bully or a tyrant. Now, if a bully or a tyrant comes and approaches you for, I don't know, your your milk money or something, and you just, okay, and they'll be back tomorrow. Now, look, nobody likes getting in a fight. Well, I shouldn't say that. Most of us don't like getting in a fight, be it an altercation verbally or physically or whatever. Point is, if you become a path of resistance instead of a path of least resistance, they'll tend to leave you alone. And an example of that is, I can't remember the man's name now, but there's a guy in Arizona that says, look, what we call driving, it's a commercial term, driving. We're not really driving in most cases, but nonetheless, it's a right, it's not a privilege, and we keep hearing in this country it's a privilege. Well, driving, yes, it is, because it's a commercial term. The point is, he does not have a driver's license, does not keep tags on his plate, license plates on his vehicle, that is, and for a long time, he got a bunch of guff. Well, because he has resisted and gone back into courts and prevailed, they're finally getting, it took them, I think, a couple, 3 years, they leave him alone. Is this what you're finding there as well?
Yes and no. Yes, in as much as there are people who are, let's just say it, a pain in the ass to the current authorities, that to some extent they leave them alone because they just go, oh, this is too much hassle to deal with this guy. In many ways, that situation glosses over and bypasses, again, the issue of the lawful validity of those officers. It kind of presumes that in some way or another, they are still lawfully valid and they can do what they ordinarily would do. What's been happening for a lot of folk recently who've been pursuing the angle of questioning the lawful validity and sticking to it, because in my mind, once you've got a notice of default, and this goes back to, again, those UCC filings that are defaults at one point, is I point to those as if a court judgment. Now, an example here is a bank, if it gets a default judgment against you for non-payment of a mortgage, they'll stand there and point at that default judgment till the cows come home. Now, I believe that we should do the same and should be rightfully entitled to point at our notices of default that we get against various authorities that ultimately determine that they have no lawful validity. So if we point to our notices of default as if it were a court judgment in the same way, we're ultimately following the same process to get there. Like going back to that ATM, that process of default exists, and that is a pretty hard thing to invalidate. But first off, you've got to change all the ATM machines around the world. And you could clog one up by just sticking a card in it and walking away, because obviously silence is not acceptance anymore. So, yeah, I believe that if the current the folk that are pursuing this challenge to the lawful validity today, who are pointing at the notices of default that they get and are actually sticking to it, the add-on that we've, I suppose, added to this scenario is the offering of terms and conditions upon finding that we're dealing with corporate entities. And from that point, we don't back off. It's like, well, here's your terms and conditions. If you'd like to accept them, just do one of the things on this schedule of rates. If you'd like to threaten me without basis, go for it. And getting back to that mindset, instead of being the fearful mindset of saying, you can't do this and you can't do that, it's like, well, yeah, come on. If you want to threaten me, okay. Let me just grab your fax number and I'll knock up an invoice and get it in the get it over to you. You want to charge me for XYZ without basis or substantiation? Certainly, go right ahead. I'll knock up an invoice for you. And so it's sometimes a strange concept to bring up, and I'd say that for most people this is quite strange. However, the contrast that I'm seeing is, instead of it being a resistant kind of thing, that you can't do this, fear, is I'm not fearful of you guys anymore. you're just working for a company, and here's your terms and conditions, and unless companies suddenly are no longer dealing with terms and conditions, I would say that my offer to you is just like any other company that's made an offer to you in terms and conditions. The method of acceptance is spelled out there. You can accept them by doing or performing a certain action. And I use in the documentary the analogy of driving into a car park. You drive into a car park, you've accepted those terms that are posted at the entry.
Right. Well, Scott, I think we're saying pretty much the same thing. You know, a war is won or lost, I suppose, by a chain of battle. And I kind of view this as just exactly that. These little dealings, be they with the police directly or later on through the courts with the judges, are individual battles and successes or losses that we're really stacking up. And just like with any other war, you know, you have your front people or your leads or point people or whatever, and you have those that are further back in the background. And I think that's what's happening. I think that's why we need to be able to point out successes and failures. Say, hey, you know, I did this and this and this, and this here worked, and it backed them all off. And then I tried this, and this is what happened, and I think it went wrong here. Because to go, I mean, this has been a long time in the making, us basically losing our true government. It's not going to happen overnight, I don't believe. I believe it's going to happen over time with these successful, with these successive battles. And so that, to me, is kind of what they are, but with the goal being, yes, to get the thing backed off and get back. I mean, I have a saying here, I've said it before, I want my country back. Now, when I say I want my country back, I mean I want the de jure republic that was left us in this country, and we fell asleep at the switch and let it be taken over from us. And I want it back.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people around who would be supportive of that. One thing I might interject with, a lot of us use the term our government to talk about the current government. And I believe with the information and the evidence that we've got at the moment, I don't think we could actually call them ours. They're someone else's.
Agreed, absolutely.
Someone else owns that government. It's not ours.
Well, that's just like with the wars. I hear people, we're over here. Our military goes, really? We? Our? Are you part of we and our here? I don't think so. You're not part of that corporate board. It's those little distinctions that I think I heard it said in regard to the United States. There's the Constitution for the United States, and then there's the Constitution of the United States. Absolutely. So of and for are small words, and yet their meanings are vastly different. Yes, they are, and unfortunately, sorry, I've got to take a jab at the American listening audience here. Unfortunately, we do not speak English very much in this country anymore. We don't even speak American anymore. They don't even know what these words mean, a lot of people. Grammar and punctuation. You say something about it, oh, my grammar, she's just fine, you know, and this kind of thing. Well, when it gets into law, of and for, as you pointed out, are vastly different. And these aren't, you know, you and I didn't make these up. These are in the law books, and they're there for a reason. And these little words mean things, and they're destroying us with the meaning of these words. Yep. Yeah, I came across a particular instance with the Department of Transport where they used the wording of the meaning of the word manufactured at Regulation 17. And I went, hang on, what do you mean at Regulation 17? Don't you mean under Regulation 17? And what it appeared was that the use of the word at meant it only means at that level, nothing that's underneath it. And I went, oh, that's a rather interesting and sneaky little tool.
And myself and my father were actually going through this and pondering over this for days, and we spent many, many hours on it. And it appeared that one word had quite a impact. So there's plenty of examples that pop up of simple things like that, which if you're asleep at the switch, as he said, it'll go straight over your head and you'll miss it.
Well, thank you for that example, because, yes, that indeed was an excellent example of what I'm trying to get out, and I'd have been hard-pressed to come up with one any better than you. So, well, listen, Scott, we're at an hour. I mean, the show's scheduled for 2 hours, but as I recall, you were wanting more or less just to do an hour, unless you'd be willing to stay with us. So do you have any other last time? I mean, where's this at with the car? Can you tell us where's your vet? What is happening with that? Is it still in quarantine, collecting dust, that beautiful thing, or what's happening there?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to keep talking. Unfortunately, yes, the car is still with customs. I have had set up the terms and conditions with them, where I said I'm happy for you to hang on to it unlawfully in exchange for the payment of my invoices. So in that regard, I am unwilling to kick out a customer from my shop, if you like, and say, hey, give me my car back, because I've established this agreement where I've said I'm happy for you to keep it in exchange for these invoices. The unfortunate thing is I haven't paid their invoices, and have, in the entire, I think we must be about 14 months now, I've had 2 letters from them, and they have avoided every single attempt to provide any evidence that they are real customs, real government, or that any of their acts are valid. And so I'm slowly escalating it up to various levels. The unfortunate thing is one can be right in some ways and still be wrong in as much as they just completely ignore you. So it's a tough one to go through. And yet I believe that the continuance of the requesting for the evidence of the lawful validity of their office, and the longer this goes on without receiving that evidence, makes it very, very damning on that organisation, and spells it out as clear as day to anyone. Blind Billy could see it, I'm sure, that, well, what are they avoiding? I mean, why aren't they providing that evidence? I mean, I think I raised it in the documentary. If you were really government, how hard would it be to pull out your certificate that's supposedly on the wall for the purpose of demonstrating you've been commissioned and you are real government, and saying, well, look, here you go. But if you weren't real government, how willing would you be to even attempt to discuss that matter? I would suggest that in that position you'd be ducking and dodging and doing all that you could to avoid that question.
Right.
And, funnily enough, guess what's happening?
That's what I was just getting ready to say. That's exactly what is happening. And interestingly enough, the color of law, I don't know, well, you guys got to have it there too. I don't know if you've run across that term or not, but for those who may not be aware, color of law is a thing that has the appearance of law. It's treated like law, but it's not real law. It's not positive law.
Brown in color as well.
Huh?
It's brown in color and it smells a bit.
Yeah, okie dokie. But the problem is when, as we've discussed earlier, you have people on the lower rungs, most notably the enforcement officers, used to be peace officers. Let's get back to that term, shall we, guys? Nonetheless, enforcement officers that think they're acting within the law and with all jurisdiction that they think that they have, that color of law can carry a bit of weight and be drug out for extended periods of time, as you're finding out. Again, one of those many battles in a protracted war here, I suppose. And so that's the problem that I see is back with what you said earlier, is educating these people. Everything from we the people en masse to the beat street cop out there to, yes, folks, some of the judges. There are people out there that are actually educating judges, ones that have been there for decades on these bench because they're not in that inner coterie that know what's going on. No. So have you run into that as well?
Yeah, and there's actually been folk that I've come across here in WA who have actually been, funnily enough, by a magistrate, respected for knowing more about what was going on than the magistrate himself. And so for him to actually make that statement was quite a positive sign that, hang on a minute, some of these guys are actually aware of what's going on and are starting to go, yeah, hang on. And I think, we're starting to see a few more resignations around the country for,
yep.
We may not know the reasons. They may not be related. I would not be surprised to think that there are some folk who are finding out what's happening and going, hang on, I can't go home and sit with my family having participated in this system. So I'm hopeful that, or confident that there are good people out there who are coming to the realisation when presented with some of this information that they're making those sort of choices, and it's not an easy choice to reach. The boundaries of the present system have been put in place fairly comprehensively to keep us doing what we're doing.
Yes, they have, and that's interesting. Two things. One is we too have had some pretty unprecedented, shall we say, early retirements, resignations, and that type of thing. But to touch on something else you brought up about with your magistrate, it's interesting because a lot of the people that seem to be in the know are not usually either the magistrate themselves or the commissioner. A lot of times the real knowledge base, for whatever reason, I guess plausible deniability they call it, is oftentimes with the assistant, fill in the blank, the assistant district attorney or whatever. And it sounds like you've got kind of the same thing there to a degree.
Oh, yeah. What I might do is I've got an example here with a local council, and what happened, I actually got a parking ticket, and so the parking ticket was signed, or with a little squiggle, parking officer ID 901. Well, I'm sure his mother didn't call him parking officer 901. And so I went to the website of this local council and found the name of a councillor off the website and wrote my notice to him and said, well, look, before I address the matter of this infringement, I'd like to establish the lawful validity of your office. And gave him the diagram and said, please provide evidence that the letters patent of 1900 were revoked, altered or amended, blah, blah, blah. And a little while down the track, I get this letter that says, we note this, and this was an invoice I'd actually sent them because I'd progressed the process quite substantially. And they said, we note this correspondence was addressed in error to the councillor, who is not a representative of the town. And I went, hang on, what's going on here? And this has come from the executive assistant to the chief executive officer. And so what it appeared to me was we've got these councillors that are frontmen for the local government, and they're being put out there as the representatives of the people. And behind the scenes, we've got this corporation that's running with a CEO and who's now put in writing that the councillors don't represent the town council. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying about certain folk not knowing what's going on, there's a clear example of this. Certain people out there in the game, not a clue as what's going on behind the scenes.
Well, it's interesting, too, you brought up about this citation or ticket. I don't know if you either have that in front of you, if you could get it in front of you, or maybe you just remember, but I suspect it's the same there that it is here. And, folks, if you look at one of these tickets, we call them, you'll find that where the police officer signs their name is in a box. And that's not just there so it looks pretty. There's a legal significance to that. You can look it up. It's called the Four Corners Rule. And what that means is that signature's not on that piece of paper. Now, stupid as that may sound, because you're looking at a signature on a piece of paper that's not there as far as law is concerned. So what that does is it basically lifts their name off that paper. Do you have the same thing there, Scott? Have you seen that, or do you remember?
I'm looking at my infringement at the moment, and no, it doesn't appear that way.
Is it bracketed? With is it actually bracketed? Sometimes it's not a full box; they'll put it in brackets.
No, it's plain on the paper.
Okay.
And what I've said to that is, again, who made that rule that it's not on the paper? And if that rule was made by someone who wasn't lawfully constituted, then that rule is worth about as much as the, not much.
Well, right, but you have these law societies that do these. I mean, look, I don't know what y'all have there. I suppose the same thing. We have the Bar Association here. And this is a law society. That's what they actually call themselves. And they make up their own rules, their own regular. And when you come into their court to play, and I mean that as a pun, court, that's what it is. You bat the ball back and forth, and the first one to miss returning it loses. So when you come into their court, you're playing by their rules. And so, yes, you're right. On the one hand, we could say, well, they're null and void because they don't have any lawful basis, and yet here we find ourselves frequently before these people. So we do kind of, to some degree, have to learn how to play that game. But I see what you're saying. Yes, it'd be nice if we could just say game, set, match, game over. Let's grab our racket and tennis balls and go home. However, we got people keep wanting to volley the thing over the net at us.
Yeah. Well, just to talk to the court aspect is, again, the same methodology that we use to determine the lawful validity of a department, given they are created by an act from Parliament, and the head of that department is commissioned by a governor. We have the same thing appears in the court. The courts are constituted by an act of Parliament, and the judges are appointed by the governor. So the whole lot is, again, going right back to that governor, which goes back to the office of the governor. And when we pull the rug out from that as not being, or the current office is an unlawfully constituted office, their court system falls over as well here in Australia. And so we've been able to, for example, folk who have had default judgments against them via mortgages have dismantled that judgment and lobbed the ball back over the court, or over the net, if you like, back to the bank, and say, sorry, fellas, you now can't rely on that court because it wasn't a constitutionally constituted court. Have another go. So it's a relatively straightforward process to do that in Australia at this point. And I think there has been for a long time an overcomplication of it. It appears that we're pulling it back to that office of the governor, which is a rather crucial point.
Well, Scott, I want to bring something up, too. I don't know if you've run into, but I want to get this out as well, because you've mentioned the office of the governor. And the reason I'm bringing this up is there's recently been kind of a stink made, not this one, well, it was this one too, but the last election cycle, about how there were oaths that were messed up, quote unquote, and then they were redone in secret after the fact. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because there is a public oath in this country. There is a public oath taken to protect, preserve, defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, blah, 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 blah. And then there's a second oath, an oath of office, that is a different oath. They're not just reiterating the same thing, folks. They're taking an oath to that office and to the corporation. Now, they're not told it's a corporation, but that's what they're doing. They're becoming board members of this corporation. Go ahead, Scott.
Well, I was going to say that's spot on. The first question that I'd ask is, which office are they taking the oath to? And that's where I think the instant that you discover that there are two offices is it makes it a whole lot easier exercise to call them out for any sort of fraud. If they're not working for the real office and they're working for one that's pretending to be the real office, then it's a fairly straightforward process to call them out for that. The challenge comes in communicating that to them and in some ways ultimately having them get that idea and go away.
Bingo, Scott, and that's exactly where I was going with that. And thank you for elaborating on that, because to me, I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but to me, these types of things are very, very important. Now, I'm going to do something that I'm kind of known by my regulars for, and that's just a little bit of trivia that is germane to the subject, at least I think it is. You know, we have a gaggle of geeks. Do you know what we call a flock of owls?
Oh, I've seen this one.
It's a parliament, Scott, a parliament of owls, because they see in the dark and they're wise. And this is what we have with these parliaments and this whole parliamentary rules with I make a motion that and I second the motion and all the ayes have it. We'll get more of that from Doc Marquis on witchcraft, but that comes straight out of there, folks. Anyway, sorry, Scott, that's my trivia for the day this evening. I usually do try to get something out because these words do mean something. You brought up a couple yourself that's just very, very important, and I'm glad you brought up that for and of, because that's something you bring out, not you. One brings out, and again, you get this look like a mule at a new gate, like, well, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard of. Well, go take it up to them. They know the difference.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the title of my documentary, Frequently Unanswered Questions, came as a result of asking all of these questions. And I think this is an exercise that can be done by really anyone. And probably worth mentioning is you have a certain amount of folk who appear to support the present regime, the present government, and they'll sit there and explain away as to how they're legitimate and why they've got this company registered in Washington, and they've got all the answers in the world. And the funny part is that all the questions that have been asked to those currently in government have gone unanswered. I go, well, hang on, here we've got commentators sitting on the sideline who can answer these questions supposedly quite easily and give you simple answers and say, oh, what are you worried about? It's because of this. It's to trade bonds or do whatever. And yet those who are actually occupying those offices, Attorney General, Governor, Minister for Justice, all of this sort of thing, are absolutely unable or unwilling to answer those same simple questions. And so I think there's certainly something to be said for those unanswered questions, and then attaching a meaning to them or laying it out as a default outcome if they don't answer.
Right. Well, Scott, on this with the either the Corvette issue itself or some of your findings with the government, is there anything that you would like to add in, either that we did not cover, some loose ends, or anything like that you'd like to share with us?
I would say probably the most promising thing is what Darrell raised when he called in about the foreclosure of these corporate governments. And I'm very encouraged by what has been done leading up to that point and subsequent discussions with numerous folk in various parts of the world on that subject. And that, to me, is a very worthwhile topic for a lot of people to study, and perhaps more so than getting bogged down in some of the nuts and bolts of the present system as we see it, and have a look at and just be willing to question that as well. Of, hang on a minute, how does this sit with me? How does this feel? Have these trustees who've foreclosed upon these corporate governments, does that sit well with me? And just try it on for a while and see what they think.
Well, Darrell's still in the queue, so I'm going to say this, get your response, and I'm going to open up his mic, because I don't know if he went off and then back in or he's just sitting there, but I'll give him a chance to speak. One of the issues, wonderful as that sounds, with these local corporate governments, in this particular case local now, to be expanded to state and national later, folks, is that with this PPP, that's public-private partnership, and this type of thing is that we had one of them in the east somewhere, the northeast somewhere, I don't remember the name of the city, where these are being privatized. And so on one hand, we can go, yay, the government has collapsed here. We can be, no, not so fast. Hold on a minute, because these are now being foreclosed on, as it were, or being assimilated by private corporations, and now they have no constitution because it's now private property. So there is something to be said for that, and I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news here, but I think that's something that we need to consider when we're talking about these corporate governments going bankrupt, because if we the people do not reseat them and they're being annexed, if you will, by private corporations, there's something there. So I don't know if you've run into that or not, but could I get a comment on that from you?
Yeah. Now, at one point, I was of the opinion that in Australia, say, for example, the corporate government that we've got here just went away. What it appears is, in as much as the way they've layered themselves over the top of the original constitutional government, that structure is still taught in schools, is all in all the textbooks. It's what we know and what we think we actually have. So if the corporate mob went away, ultimately the main difference would be that the money in the control is now not with the shareholders, it's back with the people. So if there's that same ability in some of these places to return to I suppose, just quickly to finish off on Australia, if we lost that corporate government, we had a structure underlying it that was, granted it wasn't necessarily the best, however it was a system of government that was for the people. So yeah, you're right. In the sense of, if we get rid of what we're so used to, you run into that issue of, well, what's going to replace it? And a friend of mine brought up the analogy the other day of these prisoners of war who were in camps for how many years, and the guards went away at the end of the war, and a lot of the prisoners were sort of left there going, well, do I step outside the gates? What do I do? How do I act? They were so used to being prisoners that to do anything related to freedom was foreign to them. And I think there's a lot of us in this current environment at the moment where we've been so used to being under a slavery system for so many, many years, and some of us our entire lives, that we don't know anything else. We don't know necessarily what true freedom looks like. And so to go outside of that little square is, oh, hang on, this is a bit new. What do we do? What does it look like? I don't really know myself. And so this whole lot's going to be unfolding in front of us as we create, I think another friend said, we create the road that we're driving on.
Well, that's very good, and Daryl, I will get to you in a minute, but as usual, Scott's brought up some things I'd like to address. First of all, I like that term that you used about it being layered over the top, meaning that the two governments, because that, from what I can see and tell, is exactly what we have, and I'm obviously not as familiar with y'all's history as I am with our own. And not to get bogged down in the minutia, but sometimes it's important, and I've covered this in previous shows, where you talked about the Constitution for and of and all this kind of thing. This gets back into with our Civil War that we had, and when the Constitution, or the Congress, that would be the de jure, the bona fide, what we are taught in school we have, the Republic, we might call it, was adjourned sine die. That's Latin. It means without day. And so that republic was abandoned at that point. Nobody alive today in this country has ever lived under a republic. I hate to burst people's bubbles, but they have not. And that government, that republic, yes, it's still there structurally, but it has to be reseated. And there have been attempts to do so, and we can get into that some other time, another show. There have been attempts to do that. Some claim they have, but again, that's another show. But I wanted to get into that because that is the one thing with these corporations going bankrupt, becoming insolvent, basically going away, is that I don't think it's simply a matter of it just is now, because they have to be reseated. And then as you brought up, Scott, that we don't really know how to function with that government because it's something we were kind of taught in school, but we've never, most of us anyway, really experienced that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. It's been a topic of conversation here recently. Is what does that really look like? How do we do it? What is the role of true government? And it's even using the word government today for a lot of people it's a nasty word. It has certain connotations of all of the slavery that we've been in. Yeah. And one way is a lot of the work I've looked at has been with some of the work from Ayn Rand, the author of Atlas Shrugged. And the role of government that she describes is primarily for the protection of the people's rights. So someone raises the question of, well, should the government create a school to do this? No, but we won't stop anyone from opening a school that does that. Should the government create a monopoly on this? No, and the government won't stop anyone from going and doing it themselves. They're there, in my mind, to protect us and serve us and make sure that our rights are protected. Beyond that, there's not much for them to do. We have examples of schools that can be set up and run privately and successfully. There's a number of them here in Perth. People have go and take their kids to a Steiner school or a Montessori school, and they choose what sort of education they'd like for their children. And it's not chosen for them. So I think for a lot of people that would be a breath of fresh air. For others it'd be like, oh, hang on, no, I need someone, or I want someone to prescribe certain things. And maybe that's just because we've been so used to operating in a certain environment for a long, long time that these are all foreign concepts to us in a large way. So it's very exciting times that we're in.
Well, it is true what you said. I think there is a lot of fear because, I mean, let's face it, people tend to fear that which they do not know. And when it comes to what we're talking about here, rights and responsibilities in a manner of speaking are synonymous. And that's one of the problems when you have socialism by any other name, on a socialism, communism, all the isms. It tends to remove any burden of onus of responsibility, and some people have grown accustomed to that. Now, I want to get back to that in a minute, but I real quick want to open up Daryl's mic and make sure he's not just hanging on there and see if he's got questions. And then I want to address what you said here in a minute.
Yep.
So, Daryl, you're back on. Did you still have a question or comment, or?
No, I'm just enjoying the conversation. Laurie, I just want to let you know I did send you an email. There's a bunch of attached documents there for you to review, and I'll give you something to talk about in the future, and you can pass it on to Scott.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. I didn't see your hand go away and come back, and so I didn't know if I'd missed it or not. But all right, I'll mute you back out, and thanks for the emails and for joining and listening. I hope you find the show educational. I don't know about fun, but educational.
It was educational.
All right, yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
Okay, so, Scott, I wanted to bring back up one of the things with this overlaid government. I've used the term de facto, de jure. If some of you know what that means or not, again, you can go back to the show, and I don't know if you've run into it, Scott. I suspect so.
Yes.
But when it comes to common law, which is what we had in this country for quite a while, there's really only two laws. And I'm bringing this up because of what you said, that a lot of people have a bad taste in their mouth about government, and that's because what we have now is not common law. Folks, the bottom line is there's basically only two laws under common law. Do what you say you're going to do. That's the basis of contract law. The other one is do no harm to a person or to their property, and that's common law. I mean, it can't get much simpler than that and give you much more freedom than that and still be in a society around people. What do you say to that, Scott?
I love it. It's so simple. I mean, you essentially can boil all the laws down to that. At that point, then the statement that says ignorance of the law is no excuse actually is something that means something. Where you currently got a whole 30-odd thousand laws to memorize to avoid being ignorant of them is an absolute nonsense. So no, do no harm, cause no loss. Take responsibility for your own actions. Do what you say you're going to do. It's all about self-responsibility. So to me, I love it. I love to be able to say and be responsible for the things I've said. And I think there are a few people that would find that a little confronting. And if I can say, that journey that I've gone on with importing my Corvette has been a fascinating exploration into some of my fears and the exposure of those and their real basis. And to go back to this layer of corporate government, once I came to the realization that these guys were just corporations pretending to be real government, my fear of them disappeared. And it was quite an amazing journey to go through to come to that and inspect my reactions all the way through the process. And just from, say, for example, opening a simple document that comes in the mail with the official logo and stamp and all the rest of it on the top of the envelope. A lot of times people's heart will be racing and they'll be attaching meaning to that before they even open the envelope. I know I was when I was expecting that answer to come back from the Department of Transport about my import approval. The heart started racing and I'm going, whoa, I wonder if this is my approval. And then when you open the envelope and you get a rejection, the process that you went through, and the disappointment and the fear and the concern and the anxiety, all of that stuff is, I suppose, natural. And once you shine the light on that and actually inspect it, it's an interesting exercise to go through and look at the basis of what actually caused it. So fascinating exercise.
Right. Now, you used a word that led to another one of those little trivia things, etymology. Never thought I'd be interested, but one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you're a total nerd, geek, dweeb, whatever you want to call it. You use the word ignorant. Now, I remember that. I remember my father telling me that as a child. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. What is the root of ignorance, folks? It's ignore. Okay? It doesn't mean because I don't know exactly what the law says. In fact, that contradicts the maxim of law. As long as you're asking questions, it's assumed you're trying to resolve that. It means you're ignoring that law. Everybody's ignorant. I mean, the people that write and enforce these laws, quote unquote, don't even know what they are, including the legislators. I'll try to be nice. Nancy Pelosi. We've got to pass this thing so we can see what's in it. Do I need to say any more there, folks? And same thing, we've got Fish and Game up here. They'll sit and tell you things. When you just finish reading the regs, they don't even know the regulations that they themselves are enforcing. So anyway, that's the trivia thing there. But the other thing I wanted to bring up was with rights and responsibility. When we were talking about the common law, contract law in particular, do what you say you're going to do, I think it's going to come to as a shock to many, many people if we ever do get this republic back to find out where people today, at least in this country, willy-nilly tell you they'll do something. People are going to find themselves being hauled into court and losing. Because when you tell somebody you're going to do something, that is a contract. Now, I've heard in this country for years it was not written down on a piece of paper, nothing ever happened. Well, there's another one too, and that's a man's word is his bond, and it used to be that way. So you start telling people under common law that you will do something or be somewhere and you're not, be aware you can lose on that. Have you run into any of that or considered any of that, Scott?
Yes. Not in a large way, other than I suppose that was what I was brought up with, in as much as do what you say you're going to do, be responsible, and you basically accept the consequences for the actions that you take. To be able to point blame and say, oh, it was because of this or that is abdicating that responsibility.
Yes, well, that was my point. Is with the responsibility, and this fear is because, I mean, if you're babysat all the time, you don't really have much responsibility. You just do as you're told. You can disobey and bark and bay and howl at the moon if you like, but you really don't have any responsibility. But when you're under common law, where you have the rights and the freedom to do this and that, you have to be responsible. With those rights come responsibility. And I think that's something that we, at least here anyway, have not truly experienced for a long time, and I just wanted to make that point. So, Scott, is there anything else that you would like to add here that we missed or brought up fresh in your mind or anything?
I suppose just the documentary was in many ways an interesting exercise in putting that together. It was, I suppose, like you said to Darryl, it's not necessarily a fun subject. And one of the things I did enjoy, actually, when I did the documentary was putting in some of those little cartoons. And each one of those little circumstances that led to one of those cartoons actually did happen in one shape or another. So for example, you've got a character in there, and he says, "We'll cut and paste some generic crap." I've got a letter from Customs that actually has a paragraph of generic crap.
Okay.
And so in that sense, it was quite fun. We wanted to drop in a few little things to lighten it up a little bit, and in many ways, it does highlight to take the edge off the serious nature of what it is, and hopefully that can be used as a tool. I've had people write to me from Canada, from the UK, the US, and have appreciated what we did to sort of get that word out to folk who are not necessarily aware of the full extent of what's going on, or even for many of them, it was new to them. And I think the Corvette, particularly that 1959 Corvette, was quite a useful subject material to be able to talk around with regard to this subject. So hopefully it's been beneficial to a lot of people, and I really am looking forward to having a drive in my car.
I'll bet. Well, yes, that is true, and that's something I probably need to work on a little bit, is lightening up and at least trying to interject some humor. I guess this is more of a meat versus the milk type of show, because I figure most of my listeners have at least had their feet wet with some of this stuff, but it still doesn't hurt to interject some kind of humor or something. Well, Scott, why don't you take a couple of minutes here, and, well, before I tell you that, folks, I've gotten Scott's permission. I was talking to him off air before the show started. Being he's now been officially one of the guests, I'm going to put a picture of him on the site, give him his own little page, maybe even see if I can talk him into a bio. I hadn't actually asked him about that yet. And I'm going to embed at least that video. Now, he's got some other ones, but that one I specifically want to embed. You can find that on the show's website, LorriesTalkNewsRadio.com. Go there, look around, find Scott's site. So, Scott, why don't you go ahead and take a few minutes here, plug your site, organizations, books, videos, anything you'd care to for us, please.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, as a result of the documentary, I popped up a website called truth-now.net, and just essentially laid out a handful of diagrams for validating various different types of offices. And you'll see the similarities, that they're all pointing back to the office of governor, like I mentioned earlier on. There's a few other areas on the site that talk through some of the aspects, the processes involved in achieving a default judgment, and some of the fear that surrounds discussion with so-called government. Beyond that, we've got a Facebook page. I think it's facebook.com/FUQAG from memory. I think that's it. It's linked off the documentary anyway. Beyond that, that's pretty much it. I'm not running any organisation or selling anything or anything like that. I've been hoping to share the information that I've had with as many people as possible. And so, yeah, I'm very appreciative of anyone who's watched it and supported that and shared it. And hopefully it's of use, and let's see where that takes us. And I'm confident that there's a certain threshold of people's awareness that once we reach that the present structures and power systems will just simply not be able to operate in that environment. So I use the analogy of rolling the snowball back up the hill and dropping off all of the stuff that it's collected on the way down the hill.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much, I suppose, what you've got in the States of getting back to that original republic. Roll that snowball that's monumental at the moment back up the hill to when it's a reasonably manageable kind of size, and deal with that as a starting point to go forward from in the future.
Well, that's a good analogy. Thank you for metaphor, I guess. Thank you for sharing that with us. Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a most interesting show. At least I think so. Hope folks got some things out of it. You're more than welcome back on the show anytime. I know calls are an issue, but hey, I can always conference you in because, as you know, I had Leon on the show a while back, and I had mentioned to him, I don't know, he's probably too busy to work out a regular slot, although he could easily fill that. But I would like to have him back on, and you'd be more than welcome to join then or any other time if you'd like to. So thank you for joining us, and you're more than welcome back on the show, and just appreciate your effort there just for your own car's sake, but then to go that extra mile and a half or kilometers, whatever you all got still down there, to put this out to people instead of just taking your own little battle and you know, keeping it to yourself. Actually let people know what you found.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation and for having me. And yeah, my the Corvette's still in miles. I'm looking forward to reading that 1959 Speedo sitting in the instrument cluster there. And yeah, I mean, in many ways, the documentary was to assist me in getting my car. Although I think I've reached the point now where the issues that we're talking about are far beyond just me getting my car. It's what can we do to turn this whole mess around.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you one thing, I'll bet there's not a little orange or red mark at 55 miles an hour on that thing.
Nope.
So, all right, well, I hope the battle goes well. I'm assuming that if you do get the car or some success, that you'll put out some kind of follow-up, at least an article, if not another video. I mean, you got some picture. I'd like to have a nice, clear picture of that car, too. I guess we could do it with and without dust, if you'd like. But that was a sweet-looking car, and like I told you, I'm not really, per se, a vet person, but that is a very sharp-looking vehicle.
Yeah, thank you. I've had a lot of people who've said, look, I don't follow cars, I don't like cars, and they've just gone, oh, actually, I could be converted with that one. It's a particularly shapely one. I believe it's. I think in the era it was actually sorting out and holding and sometimes beating Ferraris as well.
Wow.
So, it's got some history to it, and yeah, I'd love to get over to the States, get to the Bloomington show and Corvettes of Carlisle, and yeah, very much into those old Corvettes. Love them.
Yeah, well, just let us know when you get some kind of major development, if you would. You know, if nothing else, shoot me an email or something on Skype, and I'll put it up on the site there. Lorries Talk News Radio again, folks. Sorry, I guess I got to plug that because if I don't, it doesn't get out there. And I've been hollered at for not doing that enough, so I'm trying.
Lorries Talk Radio, was it?
Lorries Talk News Radio. It's right after the .com. It's right after the show. LorriesTalkNewsRadio.com.
Brilliant.
So thanks again for coming. Look forward to hearing from you down the road, and I'll get that up on the site there. And please do join us again and let us know what's going on, and hopefully we can get Leon back as well. So,
awesome.
All right, folks, thanks for joining us. You have a wonderful evening. Lord willing, we'll see you back here tomorrow night. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Hotline. If you are obsessive compulsive, press 1 repeatedly. If you are codependent, ask someone to press 2 for you. If you have multiple personalities, press 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you are paranoid, we know what you are and what you want. Stay on the line and we'll trace your call. If you're delusional, press 7 and your call will be transferred to the mothership. If you are schizophrenic, listen carefully and a small voice will tell you which number to press. If you are depressive, it doesn't matter which number you press, no one will answer you. If you're dyslexic, press 69696969. If you have a nervous disorder, please fidget with the hash key until the beep. After the beep, please wait for the beep. If you have a short-term memory loss, please try your call again later. And if you have low self-esteem, hang up. All our operators are too busy to talk to you.